Let's talk about Ross 13.5. This is the relative particle asher. Now, I have chosen this word very carefully, relative particle, not Mounts, Ross. Ross refers to this as a relative pronoun. I would beg to differ on that. This is not, technically speaking, a relative pronoun, but it is a relative particle, and it introduces what's called a relative clause. What is a relative clause? In English, a relative clause is a dependent clause that is introduced with the words who, which, or that. They are adjectival in function. That is to say, relative clauses modify nouns. They modify nouns. What else modifies nouns? Adjectives modify nouns. The big bird, right? The happy clam. Those are adjectives. They modify nouns. Relative clauses modify nouns as well. The bird that ate the worm. Which bird? The one that the relative clause is describing, right? That ate the worm. The clam which we ate. Which clam? The relative clause so described clam. The one we ate. All right. The noun that the relative clause will modify is called the head noun. Some people will like to refer to it as the antecedent, okay, but I do like the word head. So the head of the relative clause is what the relative clause modifies. The head of the relative clause is always outside the relative clause. That is to say, you'll see the head before the relative clause starts. For when I say the man who came to dinner, the head is man, and then who came to dinner is the relative clause that describes the man. In English, we have relative words or relative pronouns that introduce relative clauses, and those are the words who, which, or that. So let me just give you some examples here. The lady who won American Ninja Warrior is my pedicurist. All right? This is not autobiographical, by the way. I don't have a pedicurist, but what is the main clause? What is the core clause that the relative clause sits inside of? The lady is my pedicurist, okay? So the lady is the subject, is the main verb, and my pedicurist is what we would call a predicate nominative, okay? Now, the relative clause is the who, which, or that clause, and it runs from who to warrior. Okay, so I'm going to put RC here for relative clause. Who is the relative clause modifying? The lady, exactly. So what would we label that using the terms that we have here? The lady is the head of the relative clause, right? This relative clause modifies the head. It tells you something about the lady who's my pedicurist. What about her? Well, she's an awesome warrior. Not some other lady is my pedicurist, but the one who won the American Ninja Warrior. Okay? Now, here's a feature of relative clauses. Well, whatever the head is, and whatever the relative pronoun is, who, which, or that, they are co-referential. That is to say, they refer to the same thing. They are co-referential. What do pronouns do, by the way? This is a relative pronoun. What do pronouns do? They take the place of a noun, right? So pronouns replace nouns. So the noun lady and the pronoun who, they refer to the same entity, okay? So there, I'll make a picture of a lady there with nice long hair and a skirt. Same person. How do I know that they refer to the same person? Well, if I replace the head or replace the pronoun with the head lady, then it would say the same thing, right? The lady is my pedicurist. The lady won American Ninja Warrior, right? Those are the same person. They are co-referring. They refer to the same thing, okay? Here's another example. President Trump loves his comb over which most people dislike. All right. So what's the main clause here that the relative clause sits inside of? That's right. President Trump loves his comb-over. Subject, verb, comb-over, direct object, right? The relative clause is which most people dislike. Now, here's the question. What is the head of the relative clause? Okay, the comb-over. That's sort of ironic, right? The comb-over is the head. At least sits on the head, doesn't it? Okay, so the comb-over is the head, and which most people dislike is my relative clause. Great. Now, what are we saying about the comb-over? Most people dislike it, right? As I said, the head and the relative pronoun, in this case which, they are co-referential. They refer to the same thing. What does which refer to? Which refers to the comb-over. President Trump loves his comb-over, and most people dislike comb-over, right? If I replace which with the head, then it would make sense. Most people like his comb-over, dislike his comb-over. They don't like his comb-over. So here, I'll draw a picture of his comb-over here now. See, there it is. He can't smile. Yeah. All right. It looks like he's wearing a dress, doesn't it? Oh, boy. Okay. Let's look at the next one. I know the man that swallowed a pound of lard. What's the main clause? I know the man. What's the relative clause? That swallowed a pound of lard. Excellent. What's the head of the relative clause? What's being modified by it? Man. Man is the head, right? All right. And what is the relative pronoun that refers to the head? That. That's my relative pronoun, right? Okay, good. And these refer to the same thing. I know the man, and man swallowed a pound of lard. Yes? They are the same entity. And then the hairdo that I prefer is the mohawk. What is the main clause? Ah, beautiful. The hairdo is the mohawk. Subject, hairdo. Verb is predicate nominative, the mohawk. What's the relative clause? That I prefer. Okay. What is it modifying? It's modifying the hairdo. Relative clause, RC, modifies head. Hairdo. All right. Good. If I were to say, I prefer the hairdo, I'm saying the same thing, right? Or I'm referring to the same thing as the hairdo here. In other words, the relative pronoun and the hairdo are co-referential. They refer to the same thing. All right. What did you notice about all these examples of relative clauses and the head? What's that? The hairdos? They're in English. Yes. What about positioning? They don't have to be. Oh, yes, that's right. Almost all of my relative clauses were at the end in the first sentences, right? But here, the relative clause actually breaks up the main clause. So yes, you do have to be careful for that. As you're reading in Hebrew, you'll have the main clause start, something will be modified by a relative clause, and then the main clause will pick up again. Okay? Because relative clauses are clauses, they'll have their own verb, their own subjects, their own direct objects if they take direct objects, prepositional phrases and adjectives, and you have to make sure that whatever the relative clause is, that you keep it all together and that you don't try to mix constituents in the relative clause with things in the main clause, okay? In other words, the direct object of loves out here is comb-over, isn't it? The direct object of dislike is what inside the relative clause? It's the pronoun which does refer to the comb-over, right? In other words, this comb-over is the object of loves. The pronoun replacement for come over inside the relative clause, the relative pronoun, is the direct object of this other verb. What's the subject of loves? Is President Trump. So President Trump is not the subject of dislike, right? The subject of dislike inside the relative clause is most people. Okay, and my point here is just to, again, help you see that whatever the verb is inside the relative clause has its own subject and its own object and maybe its own adjectives and prepositional phrases and other modifiers. Don't try to take something inside the relative clause and give it a role outside the relative clause, okay? And don't take something inside the main clause and try to stick it into the relative clause. Usually you can bracket out your relative clause in your sentence and be able to find out where does it start and where does it end. Yes, so sometimes the subject will be explicit and sometimes it'll be implied, right? Because Hebrew verbs could just mark the subject with the inflectional personal ending and not with an actual subject, noun, or pronoun. And I've got some examples here we'll talk about in just a second here. All right, so a note here, and this reflects something that I've said. In English, the relative word serves both as a conjunction to introduce the modifying relative clause, and the relative word is a pronoun that serves a syntactic or grammatical function within the relative clause. The relative pronoun and the head always refer to the same referent. They are co-referential. The relative pronoun is sometimes described as resumptive, since it resumes the referent of the head within the relative clause. To go back here, all we're saying by that is the pronoun who resumes or picks back up the referent that the head refers to. The lady, some woman with hair that dangles like this, right? And the who is referring to the same one. That's resumptive, resumes the referent. All right, let's think about this in Hebrew now. The main word in Hebrew that introduces relative clauses is the word asher. Say that with me, asher. All right, that is a compound shava under the aleph and a segol under the sheen. So asher, the accent is going to be on that sheen. Asher, asher, asher. Now, in English, Hebrew relative clauses have a head, and that head is resumed within the relative clause as well. The resumption might be in the form, like English, Hebrew relative clauses have a head, and that head is resumed within the relative clause as well. You will either see an overt resumptive pronoun, or the resumptive element might be unstated but implied by the material in the relative clause, and I'll show you some examples of that. Unlike in English, however, and this is really critical, asher is not a relative pronoun. Okay? Most people will say when you come to asher, translate asher with who, which, or that. Translate it like it's a relative pronoun. Technically, it's not a relative pronoun. All it is a relative particle whose function is just to introduce relative clauses. When you see asher, you need to just be thinking relative clause. Where's the head? Where's the head that this relative clause is modifying? The word asher will not have a syntactic or a grammatical role to play inside the relative clause that it introduces. That's why I call it a relative particle. Relative pronouns have grammatical roles, right? The man who came to dinner. Who is the subject of came to dinner? Okay? But when I have an asher in Hebrew, asher does not actually have a grammatical role. And so let's walk through some of these examples here. Number one, I'm going to say the sentence in Hebrew, the man Moses gave to him a wife fell. Okay? The man who Moses gave to him a wife fell. That's sort of convoluted English, but look at how it happens in Hebrew. Nafal ish. Okay, what does nafal mean? To fall. That's the verb. Ha'ish is the subject. The man fell. And then notice here I have an asher clause. What do asher clauses do? Yeah, ashers introduce the relative clause, and the relative clause modifies what? Well, it could be a subject, but it modifies the thing we call a head, right? So the head is ha'ish. The asher clause is modifying it. So I'm going to learn something about the man. So the core clause is the man fell. But what about the man? The man, asher, Nathan lo Moshe isha. So notice that in the yellow, this relative clause here has its own verb. What's the verb of the relative clause? Gave, Nathan, right? So we'll put V for that. We'll make a different color. What is the role of lo? Lamed plus 3ms pronoun. Lo means to him. What would you call that grammatical role? I gave something to him. That's the indirect object, right? That's the recipient of giving. What is Moshe's role? It's the one who gave. So that's the subject of Nathan. And then Isha is the direct object. Okay? Now, Moses gave him a wife. That's the relative clauses sentence structure. Moses gave to him a wife. Who does the 3ms pronoun here refer to? It refers to the head. Exactly. So we would say that this 3ms pronoun is the resumptive pronoun. Okay? It resumes the head. So the man fell. Which man? The man which Moses gave him, that man, the same man, a wife. Now, that resumptive pronoun is overt. It's explicit. It makes great Hebrew. It's very sexy, but it's horrible English, isn't it? You don't go around saying, the woman which I sent her a letter is my mother, right? You don't use overt resumptive pronouns in English. So how are we going to translate this to make it better English? The man to whom Moses gave a wife fell. Okay? The man to whom Moses gave a wife fell. Although in Hebrew it's the man which Moses gave to him a wife fell. Okay? All right. Let's look at another example. All of these, by the way, start with the same verb and subject. Nafal ha'ish, the man fell. What about this man? I have an asher clause that modifies this man, don't I? What is the verb? Asher hu Nathan Moshe isha. What's the main verb, or the relative clause verb? Nathan. Good. So we'll use red for that. So that's the verb. Who's the subject of Nathan here? He, which is the word who, right? Good. What did the who, the he, give in the relative clause? A wife. Good. So there's my direct object. And then who's the indirect object? Moses. Okay, great. Now here's the question. Which element in the relative clause is resuming the head ha'ish? In other words, what's co-referential with it? What's the resumptive element? Here it was the indirect object referring to the head. Ah, yes. Here it's the subject. The man which he, the man, gave to Moses a wife fell. Okay? So, the subject is the resumptive element. Over here, the indirect object was the resumptive element. These two people refer to the same entity, right? So some man fell. Which man? The man who gave Moses a wife. This is a situation where, again, the subject pronoun is overt and resumptive. In English, we're not going to use it, are we? We wouldn't say the man who he gave to Moses a wife fell, right? Again, lovely Hebrew, very bad English. So we're going to smooth it out here. Next, nafal ha'ish. There's my main clause. Verb, subject, the man fell. But what about this man? Look at what I have. Asher Nathan LeMoshe Isha. Where's the the verb of the relative clause? Nathan. Good. What's the indirect object? LeMoshe. What's Isha's role? Direct object. Great. Who is the Asher clause, the relative clause, modifying? Well, it's modifying Ha'ish, the man, right? What is the resumptive element for Ha'ish inside the relative clause? And do you see the he here? No. The resumptive element is unstated or null. So I'll put that little circle with the slash line. But it's the subject, isn't it? So the man which he, the man, gave Moses a wife, that man fell. All right? So this is a situation where in the first two, we had overt resumption. If something's overt, it's visible. In the third one, the resumptive element is covert, hidden. You can't see it. It's null. It's unstated. But it's implied, right? By the inflection, the 3ms form of the verb Nathan. Okay, and then lastly, we have nafal ha'ish. Again, verb followed by the subject, the man fell. And what about this man? The man asher Bahekal. What is this saying about that man? The man who in the temple. What is, remember, we're calling these Asher clauses relative clauses. To be a clause, you have to have a subject and a verb. They might be explicit or overt. They might be covert. But you got to have like some kind of a verb with its subject. What's the verb here? The verb is. That is to say, it's a copula that's unstated, right? What is in the temple? Some he is in the temple. Well, that subject is unstated as well, right? It's he. So it's the man, Asher, which he, the man, is Bahekal, in the temple. That man fell. So how would we translate this into English? We would say the man who is in the temple. Okay? The man who is in the temple fell. Hebrew could drop the resumptive element. The resumptive element is the he that's unstated. And then you could also have a copula that's unstated. So this is where you're missing several things, but you can still make good sense of it in your translation, right? So over here, I've indicated by these null symbols that things are unstated, but are definitely implied by the grammar of the sentence. Okay? So that's Hebrew relative clauses. And as we come to them in our translation work, we'll try to bracket out the relative clauses and show you, or find where the head is, and then what the resumptive element is when we see it.